Hello and welcome to Learn Data. It's great to have you on this channel. I'm Nilesh, and in this video we are going to continue talking about unsupervised learning methods. And here we'll talk about manifold learning, and there are several topics in this section that we have listed here. So I'll first go over what the general terminologies mean, and then these are all the methods. So the discussion would be more of intuition rather than an in-depth mathematical derivation. I'll try my best to explain what each of these methods do or how they work. So let's get started. The references are listed on this particular slide. So if you feel the need to look further, these are the references that I found most easy to understand and relevant. Some of them are mathematically heavy, so if you are not math inclined, you still can get the explanation sort of details from some of these references that are listed here. So as you probably already know, Euclidean distance is just a straight distance between these points. Suppose we have this circle and we have these 2 points in blue. If we want to find the Euclidean distance, it would be denoted by this dotted magenta line. Now there is something called a geodesic distance. So what geodesic distance would do is it will measure the distance between this point, but not along this straight line, but along the curvature of the surface. So imagine if this gray circle is planet Earth and these 2 blue dots are 2 cities on different sides of the Earth. Now if we want to find the distance between these 2 cities, the distance that we are actually measuring is the geodesic distance rather than the Euclidean distance. So the idea then is, if we use Euclidean distance to kind of approximately get the value of a geodesic distance. So here, on the same figure, imagine there are these small cities, and there are a number of cities between these 2 blue cities. And what we can then do is we can find these Euclidean distances from these smaller cities, and together the Euclidean distance would be kind of closer to the actual geodesic distance. So this is the reason why we are discussing this, is because that's one of the methods that is used in manifold learning. So what is a manifold then? Manifold, you can think of it as a subset of points in space that are arranged in this particular fashion. This here I'm showing it in 2D, here this is in 3D. So a manifold is so the way I'm interpreting it is a set of data points that are arranged along some sort of curvature in a given space of any dimension. So here we are just looking at 2 and 3 dimensions. So what is then manifold learning? So manifold learning, what we are trying to do is, if you remember, we've looked at clustering. So the idea is to separate groups of clusters. However, the challenge when the data points are arranged in this particular fashion, it's sometimes not possible to identify the clusters easily. So for example, in this case, if we try to project these points along this inclined line, we do get the separation. However, if we have a line that is parallel to x-axis, then we are mixing different clusters. So the red, orange, and blue are getting mixed up. So this is in 2D. So if the data set is arranged in 3 or more dimensions, you can imagine that it becomes more and more difficult to separate out the data points that are arranged in curves or curves such that they are kind of entwined with each other. And so manifold learning, what it does, it tends to unfold the curved space of data points such that the distances or the geometries of the data points in the multidimensional space is the same or is at least similar to what is in the unfolded low dimensional space. So let's say we have this S here, that's a high dimensional space, in this case 2D. If we unravel or unfold this S, it can become a straight line as shown here, and we can see the red points are nicely on the left hand side, then we have the yellow or orange points in the middle and the blue points on the right hand side. So we have unfolded this S into this, so we have gone from two-dimensional space to one-dimensional space. And in the similar way, if there are multi-dimensional spaces, so more than 3, then we can approximate the spacing or geometry of the way the data points are distributed in the high dimensional space and map it down to a low dimensional space that we can visualize and make sense of. So one of the methods is Isomap, and in Isomap, as we can see here, if the idea is to find the distance between this red point and this orange point, one way we could do that is by Euclidean distance, which would be the straight distance from here, but that's not exactly representative of how the data points lie in that particular space. So here the orange data point is much farther to the red data point because they are on a curve, and the Euclidean distance may not be able to capture that. So another alternative then, as we saw, is geodesic distance. So we can calculate the distance along this curve and find the actual separation of this red point with this yellow point, and this particular distance is preserved when we unfold this manifold into a low dimensional space, which is then based on geodesic distance, or it could be based on smaller Euclidean distances added up together. So if we look at a three-dimensional manifold shown here by the data points arranged in a fashion of the letter S, here on this particular plot I've drawn some of these dots, red dots, orange dots and blue dots. So the general method with Isomap then is to find k nearest neighbor for each of the data points and create this KNN graph. I drew this by hand, so it probably is not exact or accurate, but it is just to show that the method first creates a KNN graph as shown here, and then distances are calculated based on this graph. So the shortest distance from this point to this point is calculated based on this graph, and the care is taken while creating this graph that these connections, such as shown here by the magenta lines, do not occur, so as to preserve the shape or the contour of the manifold. So the graph would be along the surface of the manifold rather than creating these edges that are shown here. And while if there are curvatures that are complicated, then this could happen. So that's a completely different topic, but just for this explanation, Isomap creates a KNN graph as shown here, and then using that KNN graph, a shortest path is found between data points, and that is used to embed or unfold the manifold into a low dimensional space such as shown here. So here we are going from a 3D space to a 2D space, and as you can see, if these data points were unfolded, this manifold was unfolded as shown here on the right hand side, then the distance between these two magenta dots would be this distance shown by the magenta line, and that would be preserved after the unfolding of manifold, which is shown here. And the straight line is the actual geodesic distance. So the idea then is that the shortest path, this calculated distance, would be as close as possible to the geodesic distance between these two data points. And so that's the basic idea behind Isomap. And this is the cost function for the Isomap. So here we have distance matrix of graph distances, and we have matrix of Euclidean distances. So we are trying to minimize the error between these two, and that's the cost function. Next, this is locally linear embedding, LLE. So in this particular method, we have this set of data points. We pick one data point, let's say xi, shown here in magenta. Then what we do is we find neighbors for this particular data point, and then using those neighbors for that data point, we try to find the weight matrix W. And this is in high dimensional space. As you can see, there are several axes here. Then once we have the W weight matrix, what we then do is when we map it to a low dimensional space or embed it to a low dimensional space as shown here on the rightmost side, we use that particular weight matrix to find the neighbors. So here we use the neighbors to find W, here we use W to find the neighbors in the low dimensional space. And these are the two cost functions associated with LLE. So the top one, we do not know W, what we know is the xi and xj. So once we find the W, we can use that here where the y is unknown. So we use the W's to find the y's. So that's the locally linear embedding, LLE. Next, there is a version of LLE which is modified locally linear embedding, and according to the docs, LLE has regularization problems, so that is fixed by using modified local linear embedding, which uses these multiple weight vectors in each of the neighborhoods. And to implement this in Scikit-learn, we can specify method is equal to modified. We are not going to much detail on how the MLE works beyond this. Next is Hessian Eigenmapping, or it is also called Hessian based LLE or HLLE. Again, this method tries to overcome the regularization problem with LLE, and it does so by using a Hessian based quadratic form. And I'll explain what Hessian is and what a quadratic form is in the next slide. And to implement this in Scikit-learn, the method we can specify Hessian. So what Hessian is Hessian matrix is example shown here. It's a matrix, is a symmetric matrix of second partial derivatives. So let's say we have a function x that we are trying to find the Hessian matrix for, then this would be the way it can be represented. And the notation for that could be written as h of f. And the quadratic form, again we have the squared values. So this particular equation can be written in the form as shown here, and which can be written in the notation form as shown here, x transpose A x. So the Hessian eigenmapping, as we saw in the Hessian matrix, is it uses the second order partial derivatives to find to record the locally linear structure. I know that this is not quite in depth, but just to give you an idea of what Hessian eigenmapping is, this is what I've tried to explain. Essentially what this helps us do is find the points of local minima and maxima when we are trying to map the high dimensional space of data points to a low dimensional space. There's a lot of maths involved in this, which is what we are not discussing here. Next is spectral embedding, and in spectral embedding, the idea is if we have these data points shown here by the gray circles, we can create a graph or a network by connecting these data points, and then based on the density of connections we can form clusters. We can identify the clusters or group. So here this particular bluish cluster, it has more dense regions, and there is this green cluster which has a set of more connections, whereas there are few connections between these two clusters. So the idea then is to find a way to partition these clusters based on the number of connections between these zones, so to speak. So the idea and the very broad overview of how this method would work then is we have the adjacency matrix, then we calculate the degree matrix, and from that we calculate the graph Laplacian matrix, and that helps us find the partition between clusters to identify these separate clusters. I know again that this is not very much in detail, but just to give you some intuition on how this works. So this is how the spectral embedding would work. Then the next method is local tangent space alignment, LTSA, and in this method the local geometry at each neighborhood is used, and that is used to find the tangent space, and then those alignment of those tangent spaces is used to map the data points from a high dimensional space to a low dimensional space. And the method in Scikit-learn we can specify as LTSA when using this method. So what is a tangent space then? Let's say we have a manifold that is shown here by these lines, and we have a data point up there shown as a black dot. If we draw a curve along that manifold that passes through that particular dot, then we can draw a tangent to that surface as shown by the magenta arrow. Similarly, if we have another curve shown here by the blue arrow, we can draw another tangent at the same point. And so multiple curves at the same point, we can draw multiple tangents, and all those tangents can be represented by what is called as a tangent space, and that's what we have. So the idea then, this is the Wikipedia definition up there, is that when a manifold is correctly unfolded, then all of the tangent hyperplanes to the manifold will become aligned. And here is just my intuition of kind of visualizing what the local tangent space alignment could look like. So here, let's say we have this manifold shown here in light blue color, and we have these tangent spaces at different parts of the manifold. So now if we are unfolding this manifold, then we can check the alignment of these tangent spaces, and finally when we have the manifold correctly unfolded, then the tangent spaces would be more or less aligned, and that's when we know that we have correctly unfolded the manifold. And now this was again a very superficial discussion on local tangent spaces, but if you are more interested in learning further, I suggest checking out the references that are listed at the beginning of the this particular video. The next is multidimensional scaling. So this has two types, metric MDS and non-metric MDS. So the difference between these two is that the non-metric MDS, it preserves the order of distances, whereas metric MDS looks at the actual distances to find the similarity or dissimilarity between data points. And again, the loss function or cost functions for each of those are given here, and they are named as stress. So we have this stress D, which is given here, and then we have this value for stress, which is given right here. The next is t-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding, t-SNE or t-SNE. So in this particular method, let's say we have these data points shown here on the left in a high dimensional space. Then the idea is that let's say we pick a point shown here by the black dot, we draw a Gaussian around that dot, and then we find where each of these data points lie under that Gaussian. So this is shown here in the bottom normal distribution plot. So the Gaussian again is centered at the point of interest, so the data point that we are looking at, and then we find the probabilities for each of these other points relative to this Gaussian that is centered at this data point, and that is used to calculate the value of P. And this is a conditional probability. I'll show it on the next slide. And this is then used to map the data points to a low dimensional space, and in the low dimensional space the data points are arranged based on another distribution, which is a T distribution. Using the again same concept, we draw this distribution and then find the probabilities that the data point belongs to that distribution, and based on that these data points are rearranged until finally we get the two separated out clusters in the low dimensional space. And the values for the equation for calculating the conditional probability in high and low dimensional spaces, P j given I and Q j given I are given by these two relations shown here. And point to note here is that the xi from high dimensional space is mapped to yi in the low dimensional space, and in the mathematical calculations in each of those iterations to find out if the pi value is close enough to q, p value is close enough to q, there is another relation that is shown here, which is Kullback-Leibler relation, that is used to identify when to stop the iterations so that we know that these values are close together. So what that tells us is that the similarity or closeness of the data point in the high dimensional space is more or less equal to or close enough in the low dimensional space as well. when these probabilities are closer together. And the reason why it is t-distributed, again, I've put the reference here for if you like to get more intuition on this. Let's say we have these 3 data points that are connected, and now if we unfold this manifold of 3 data points as shown on the right hand side, this point moves farther away from this point. And the idea then in t-SNE is that we care about the points that are closer together, and we don't care much about the points that are farther together. So when we use the t-distribution has a heavier tail and is a little flatter than a normal distribution. So the points that are farther in the manifold, they will move farther apart in low dimensional space as well. And another implementation of t-SNE in scikit-learn is the Barnes-Hut t-SNE, and this is a very brief or kind of intuition of what it does. Let's say we have this set of data points. This is the point of interest shown here in the black dot. We divide the space into grids, and then instead of reaching out to each of these data points in the multi-dimensional space, what we can do is approximate each of these small clusters. So instead of looking at these 4 points, we just look at one point that is shown here, and then we can look at another point here, and then find the distances relative to those. So the farther points are, we can approximate the distance to that particular region by just one measurement, whereas if the points are closer to this data point, then we can be more specific and find the distances to each of these data points that are closer by. So farther apart, we approximate. Closer we are, we try to calculate the values for each of the data points. So finer measurements here, coarser measurements as we move outside. And the control parameters for t-SNE in scikit-learn is the most important one, perplexity. So larger the values of perplexity, then so what we get then is more nearest neighbors, and it's less sensitive to smaller structure. There's also early exaggeration factor. So large factors result in larger gaps between the natural clusters in the data. Learning rate, as you probably already know, so it can be tuned. So if it's too slow, then the chances are that it could get stuck in local minima. If it's too large, it could overshoot in the learning process. Then we have maximum number of iterations that can be set, and angle. So larger angles imply that we can approximate larger regions by a single point, leading to better speed but less accurate results. So that was a brief intuition about what t-SNE is and how it works. And finally, here is a plot again from scikit-learn docs. I've listed the source here, so if you run that code, you'll be able to reproduce this particular figure. We have a manifold shown here on the left hand side, which is S letter shape. And when we unfold this manifold of data points using different methods, these are the outputs that we get. And so one point that we can immediately note in this is that the t-SNE takes the longest time. It takes around 2.7 seconds, whereas the shortest time is for this SE or LLE, which is 0.09 and 0.08. But apart from that, the methods LTSA, which is the tangent space, we get a nice rectangular unfolded manifold. Similarly, for Hessian and modified LLE, we do get rectangular manifolds, and the same is the case with Isomap. Now for MDS, the striking feature of this method is that it does preserve the local distances, but as you can see, it also preserves the local structure, as in the S shape still can be seen from high dimensional space in low dimensional space as well. So that's one of the points to note with MDS method. So that was it for this video. In the next video, we'll look at the actual implementation in Python and look at a couple of examples where we can use all of these methods to unfold the manifold and see if we can identify clusters. I know this particular intuition video was not in-depth, but if you do have any questions about any of these methods, please let me know in the comment section below. I hope to see you all in the next video. Please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.